Teachers often ask students to identify conflict in the things that they read, but I think it begs a really important question, which is why do we really look for conflict in what we read? And the answer actually has a lot to do with why we really read in the first place. You might be thinking that we read for kind of school reasons, right? So to do well in school, to summarize what happened in what you had just read, to prove that you had read it, right? To do well on a test, to complete an assignment, and all of those things are very real. But we actually read so that we can ask better questions. And this is where conflict comes in, because conflict actually shows us the way to those questions. It's because of the conflict that we can find these moments to ask better questions. So the better questions live in the conflict. I'm sure you're wondering, what the heck does that mean, that questions live in conflict? Well, I'm telling you, it's a lot like butter. And this is why. When you go and you try to spread butter on a piece of toast, and it's really easy to spread, we don't think about the butter at all, right? Because it is easy and smooth. When there is no conflict, we just kind of carry on and we don't ever really pause. This is what conflict does. It makes us pause. So if we're back to that butter example, right? If you're trying to butter a piece of toast and you can't even cut the butter because it's difficult to cut through or to spread, then we actually do start thinking about things, right? We actually do start asking questions and we wonder, like, should I cut it differently? Should I use a different knife? Maybe I should get it to room temperature. And so this is where we see that pausing of conflict that forces us to ask questions. I think it's also really interesting when we take a look at the kinds of questions conflict requires us to ask. Almost all of them have to do with some kind of change. They're requiring a change, wondering about a change, forcing a change. So that also is a really interesting, I think, an important connection between conflict and change. There are all kinds of conflict that create these questions and all kinds of conflict that we look for in the text that we read. So I want to take a look at those together. If we start with probably the most common one, which is person to person, and if we try to make sense of this as though we are climbing a mountain, right? If you're climbing a mountain with another person, you are eventually going to probably argue with that person. And if that happens, you might start wondering things like, why did I even bring this person along? Do I even know him? That brings us to person versus self conflict. So in this scenario, you're climbing the mountain, but now you're all by yourself and you are left with your thoughts, which is sometimes the scariest conflict of all. And when that happens, and when you sit with your thoughts and you start to question yourself, you might find yourself asking questions like, what am I doing with my life? Or what do I really value? If we continue with this mountain metaphor and look at that conflict of person versus society, we would maybe think about all of the rules that somebody might have to follow when they're climbing the mountain, right? So there might be signs about staying on the path or the rules of the trails. And what oftentimes happens for characters and people when they are in conflict with society is that the rules and the structure of the society do not work for them. So society might say, here is the path. This is how narrow it is. This is how wide it is. You cannot go on this one. You can only go on that one. And when that conflict ensues, the questions that emerge are ones like, who makes the rules anyway? Or what if I don't even want to follow them? Then we can move to person versus technology. So I do want to say that a lot of times in science fiction, the technology is a lot more concrete, like it's actually robots and things like that. But in this particular example, here you are climbing a mountain and your technology, which in this case is like your equipment, it doesn't work. It might even be outsmarting you. When that happens, we start to ask questions about our relationship to that technology. So we wonder, could I actually do this on my own? Am I too dependent on that technology? Is it taking over because I've become lazy? And actually, even in those science fiction examples, a lot of times those are the questions that ultimately are showing up too. Now we move to person versus nature. So in this example, you're climbing the mountain and it's tough, right? Because climbing mountains is tough business. And you might even believe that the mountain is beating you at some point in time. And it actually might be, because it is, right? So kind of ominous. When people are in conflict with nature, usually the questions they ask are about feeling small. So might ask questions like, why did I ever think I was more powerful than nature to begin with? Or if this mountain is humbling me, why did I need this lesson? Which brings us to really kind of the last kind of conflict, which is person versus God or the universe. So this oftentimes requires us to ask the biggest questions, oftentimes the most philosophic questions. And it often happens when we experience a series of things going wrong. So in this case, you're climbing a mountain, everything seems to be going wrong, right? You sprain your ankle, you get caught in the hailstorm, you lose your compass. And when that happens, we ask these really big questions like, well, why is this happening to me? You know, I'm a good person, so why is this whole life thing have to be so hard? Or the biggest one maybe is, why do I have to suffer? Of course, the mountain is also a metaphor for any kind of conflict or struggle or challenge that we must confront as humans. And that's why we look for conflict in what we read. It's to ask better questions and to learn how others have answered them. And it's so you know that as long as you are a reader, you will never have to be alone.